Right. I've got two topics I want to talk about. First is to outline some work I've done on urbanisation in Tanzania. And when I describe it as my project, I should immediately acknowledge good support from Anne Naski, who's here today, and also Gloria Mapunda, who's our research assistant in Dar es Salaam. And secondly, I was going to make a few slightly provocative remarks about spatial equilibrium in an African context. I pressed it the right way. So, motivation for the project. This is supported by IGC. It's in two phases. The report on phase one is available on the IGC website. It's been there for about a year. I guess there's one or two people who may have looked at it. And phase two is due 31st May, about a week from now. So what's the project about? Urbanisation in Tanzania, as in many other SSA countries, is proceeding rapidly. It doesn't seem to be acting as the engine of growth that we would like it to be, as compared with, for example, Asia, particularly China. So the question is, why not? And we can divide this into, is it economic fundamentals or institutions? The work I've done focuses mainly on economic fundamentals, but I certainly don't rule out the possibility that institutions are rather important. My broad approach, I don't think this is controversial. I don't think it's enough just to look at the towns and cities and how they're growing, what the numbers are doing. I see urban areas as being embedded in the wider economy and forming an urban system within that. I also think you need to look at the dynamics, and this has been mentioned once or twice already. What's the effect of population growth? What are conditions in rural areas doing? How are they changing? Rural-urban migration plays a big part in what I'm doing, and relations between large and small towns. So there's a lot there. I think the distinctive feature of what I've done is, in the literature, cross-country studies are tremendously important these days, and that's how people get enough observations to get some significant results, and it's tremendously well regarded by editors of journals. But in countries like Tanzania, which is quite big, 45 million people, we've got about 20 regions. It's 25 now, but I used 20 from the 2002 census division. And there's enormous variation in the conditions in these regions, which can be exploited to help search for explanations for what is going on. So the topography varies, the climate varies, a whole lot of things varies, the kind of crops that they're suitable for and so on. There's a lot of variation there, and in many ways this in-country variation is more interesting than cross-country comparisons, I feel. Phase one, as I say, it's on the website. Key findings, these are mainly facts rather than... the urban population in Tanzania is about 18 times up over roughly the period since '67, the first census after independence, to 2012, the latest one. So, and it's about 12.7 million now. Rural population in the same period has increased about 3 times. And to my mind, this is a more worrying figure because obviously the amount of cultivatable land has not increased. Technology in the rural areas has not improved a great deal. Water resources remain what they were at the beginning. And the pressure, which is evidence in some of the environmental deterioration that's been documented, is more severe, quite a lot more severe than it was 50 years ago, despite rapid urbanisation. Now, to try and understand the numbers, my numbers are extracted mainly from the censuses. I've developed these standardised measures of what's happening in the 20 regions I'm looking at. There's a propensity for rural outmigration. This compares the rural population that emerged in 2012 with what you'd expect it to be if that region had grown at the same rate as the national population. Similarly, regional immigration, you compare the regional population with what you would expect if that region had grown at the national rate. And urban in-migration, you compare the urban population with what you would have expected. And we find big differences between regions. And here they are. I'm not sure how well the colours show up, but these regions have been organised in descending order of regional in-migration. So at this end we have regions where the regional population you find in 2012 is something of the order of 50% higher than you would expect if it had grown at the national rate. And down at the far end we have regions like Mtwara and Lindi, which are about 30% lower than you would expect if they'd grown at the national rate. So that's the way the regions are organised. The next line, which is close to it and roughly goes in the opposite direction, is rural out-migration. And broadly there's a correspondence in that countries with high regional in-migration had low rural out-migration, except in the case of Dar es Salaam, Pwani region at the end here. So that's roughly what you'd expect. If a region is attractive to in-migrants, probably the rural people will not particularly be leaving that region. Then the other line is dramatically different. This is urban in-migration. And you can see, although there is, if you put a line through it, it would probably go downwards. There's a lot of variation. What this signals is that the drivers of urbanisation, urban in-migration, are not the same as the drivers of rural out-migration, roughly speaking. There's a lot of places where the urbanisation is much higher than you'd expect, and a lot of places where it's much lower than you'd expect, and so that's a very interesting piece of information to try and exploit. Phase 2, which I'm just in the process of winding up, is to try to relate these indicators and to developments in the Tanzanian economy. So I've sought through the literature on economic development in Tanzania, and particularly tried to dig up, with the help of Gloria and Anne, data at regional level in support of this. And my report will be essentially a narrative, and therefore rather weak on quantification, at the national level and at the regional level. And the hope is that the understanding of this narrative will assist development of policies which will enable Tanzanian authorities to improve the contribution of urbanisation to growth and welfare. Another chart just to bring home the facts. The top line is total population growth, averaging nearly around about 3% per annum. Just below that is the rural population, a little bit slower. Next line is total urban population, growing up at roughly twice the rate of the general population. It's somewhere between 5 and 6%, a little bit higher than the number Vernon mentioned. In a way, the more interesting bit is down at the bottom. The third one up is Dar es Salaam, which was rather a high proportion of the total population in 1957, and has grown slightly slower than the next line, which is the regional capitals, and slower still than the bottom line, which is other urban areas. And by the end of this period, 2012, we find that about a third, they each account for about a third of the urban population. So that Dar es Salaam is 4.5 million roughly. The 20 regional capitals give you another 4.5 million roughly, and all the other urban areas give you another 4.5 million roughly, giving up the 12 which we had earlier on. Now, there's only one Dar es Salaam. There's 20 regional capitals, and there's around about 120 of the other towns, so you can work out the average size, and this brings home the point about primacy that was being made, so that is it an average of 200,000 for the regional capitals and an average of somewhere around about 20,000 for the smaller towns. So there's a big difference between Dar es Salaam and all the rest. Nevertheless, it's the smaller towns which have been growing most strongly, particularly in the period soon after independence. Now, although my report is mainly a narrative one, I've also attempted a bit of quantitative analysis, because having dug up an awful lot of regional data of mixed value, I wanted to make some use of it. What I'm trying to do here is to throw some light on what is driving rural outmigration. The question sort of at the bottom is it rural push or urban pull? And this is my crude specification, which I realise will be greeted with derision by the serious professionals in the audience. I can actually provide for you a sort of theoretical underpinning for a specification something like this, which involves a supply of migrants from rural areas and a demand for migrants in urban areas, depending on some kind of a production function context. But it's not very strong justification, and in particular there's a total lack of information about the capital invested in the urban areas, which is a rather important part of the urban side of the story, and I have no real information on that. So with my crude specification, the rationale roughly is higher land density can be expected to drive higher rural outmigration. Higher rainfall, on the other, which in Tanzania is closely associated with areas with better soils, can be expected to lower rural outmigration. Higher urban population in your own region may be a sign that your urban area is growing strongly and is attractive and is creating jobs, so that might lead to higher rural outmigration. Finally, the main destiny for migrants in Tanzania is Dar es Salaam, the commercial capital, and the further away you are, there's a spatial friction at least, which would lower rural outmigration, I hypothesize. Let me just mention two other things. Tanzania has been affected from time to time by quite large inflows of refugees, particularly from Burundi, and I've tried to adjust the numbers to correct for that so that the refugees have been taken out. They boost rural populations in the areas where they end up. It's very difficult to find the exact figures, but they run into the hundreds of thousands at some periods. Finally, in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a big growth in artisanal mining in areas like Tabora, Shinyanga, Mwanza areas, particularly around Gaita, where there's a gold mining area. And I stuck in a dummy to see if I could pick up that effect. And here are the results. This is the only table I promised for the literary ones here. What do we find? The land density effect is a positive impact on rural outmigration in the first two intercensal periods, but goes the other way, not significantly, in the third. Rainfall has the opposite effect from what you'd expect in 78 to 88, and I don't know what the reason for that is. It's as expected but not significant, 88 to 2002. The wrong sign but not significant, 2002 to 12. Urban population, which has been put in log form because it's a very skewed distribution. This does not appear, at least in the first two periods, that a large urban population in your own region attracts more people from the rural areas. In fact, rather the opposite. But it went the other way, 2002. Next column, which seems to be the most interesting one out of this particular little exercise, is the distance from Dar, which proves to be highly significant in all periods, and that links up with some of the other things we've been hearing about in this conference. On the urban population one, I would just mention, when I change the independent variable to regional in-migration, I get highly significant numbers for urban population as well. So regions which have got a big urban population, these are Mwanza, Mbeya, Dar, Arusha, do attract migrants from elsewhere, but not necessarily rural out-migrations from their own, in their own region. So that's a little bit of quantification I was showing here. There is more in the paper, and in particular, I have tried to put down for the use of other researchers as much of the regional data as we've been able to gather, so that someone else who can pick it up and run better with it is welcome to use that. But it's not very impressive, and perhaps I'd say, not as a rhetorical question, you guys who are much cleverer than me, what would you do with my 20 regions and my data? Moving on. Is there a better approach? Well, yes. There's a lot of talk about general equilibrium models, take fuller account of rural-urban interactions and so on. There is a paper on the IGC website that Chris Adam tells me needs more work, which tries to do this for Tanzania. Also attractive, and this is something I think is needs more attention than it gets, is dynamic modelling. Neither of those are within the sort of resources that I am able to deploy in this project. The IGC in its generosity has given me about 20 days for phase 1 and 20 days for phase 2 and a bit more for travelling to and from Dar. But it's not a big budget, and I don't have a large flock of research assistants either. So there's a challenge to develop models in these kind of ways for the next generation of urban researchers. What have we learned? Census-based data on migration and urbanisation. I've established a database, help yourself. Some evidence for rural push in the earlier periods, and I personally think there's a lot of reason for concern about the pressure of population on land and other resources. Large urban population favours regional in-migration, not very surprising, but it's good to see it there. Greater distance from Dar discourages out-migration, but the methods I've been able to deploy are not really robust enough to be very confident. So my conclusion on that is we need more case studies, particularly of towns other than Dar, to help us identify what's going on in the urban areas of Tanzania. I mentioned there the regional annexes, which include all the data I've been able to assemble on the regions of Tanzania. And I was also encouraged to learn, incidentally, that Joachim de Wert and Luc Christians, and whom some of you may know, are doing some work on this very topic as we speak. What about some wider lessons? Applying not just to Tanzania, but to any SSA country and perhaps more widely. Census data can be very useful for economic as well as demographic research, and certainly in Tanzania it's one of the better sources of data, so in some ways you're almost trying to infer from the demographic data what's happening in the economy rather than the other way around. Regional studies, that's to say studies of regions within large countries, may be just as valuable as cross-country studies, I suggest. To improve the kind of work here, more kind of new economic geography insights would be very useful. I mean, transport, I haven't been able to do much on transport costs, just distance. Agglomeration economies, the extent to which they exist and how strong they are, I don't know. Rapid population growth is a problem. Tony's vicious circle model, I see something like that is happening in Tanzania and in many other countries, and I think it's driven mainly by high population growth in rural areas, depressing marginal productivity. People even go to the cities. There's insufficient investment in the cities. Marginal products there are also not very high, and if you'd make it into a dynamic model, you can go round and round in a vicious circle, and I rather fear that that is what's happening. Role of government, particularly local government, matters. I think I made one or two interventions. 1 minute to go. That's going to leave me a little time for my best bit. Anyway, finally, research can make a contribution, but I think the focus needs to be more on appropriate urban policies and mobilisation of resources in ways which I've talked about. Now, this is the bit you would have you put up the 1 minute note just when I got to this bit. I think the IGC has been immensely fortunate or clever to attract Glaeser to direct our cities programme. and many of us will be admirers of this particular book, 2008, because it takes us under the bonnet and shows us how these models are put together and how they work. But I was left. I mean, when you can see what's there, you can also see what's not there. And applicability to developing countries is a question mark in my mind. And here, I'm going to be a little bit controversial, possibly even heretical. I'm not a great fan of equilibrium. Don't get me wrong. I do understand how equilibrium enables us to derive strong analytical results. The problem in my mind is it's not a good description of the world we're being confronted with, particularly in Africa. So just taking through the three main elements of spatial equilibrium, people choose location to equalize utility, very plausible. But in developing countries like Tanzania, severe frictions and rapid population growth. Second leg of the theory, firms locate trade-off cost of inputs against market access. Okay for the modern firms in the economy. Are subsistence firms in this thing, and they're not very mobile? What about the informal sector? How do you deal with them? Builders build houses where they're needed up to the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Well, not in Africa. The formal housing market, as has come out, is poorly developed. And informal settlements, I'm not sure how you fit them into this kind of framework. Governments, at least in Chapter 3 of the 2008, there's no government. So where does infrastructure come from, you may ask? So my conclusion of this is, I mean, it's enormously valuable and has produced some amazing results in trying to analyse what's happening in developed countries. But when we try to turn to understanding what's happening in countries like Tanzania, considerable extension, adaptation is needed to achieve a reliable theoretical guide. A challenge for us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.